Hey everyone! Today, we're diving into something truly fascinating topic, the mysterious world of the ancient Druids. Now, you've probably heard of Druids in movies or books, maybe as wise old wizards or magical figures, but who were they really? Druids were actually a key part of ancient Celtic society, and they wore many hats. They weren't just religious leaders, they were also the top legal minds, the ones who settled disputes, kept ancient traditions alive, and even advised political leaders. Imagine someone who was a priest, judge, historian, doctor, and politician all rolled into one. That's what a Druid was. But here's the thing, they left no written records of their own. Even though they were likely literate, their teachings and knowledge were passed down orally. Why? Well, it seems they believed that writing it all down would make their sacred knowledge too accessible, or maybe they wanted to keep their memory sharp. Whatever the reason, everything we know about Druids comes from outsiders like the Romans and Greeks, who wrote about them. The first mentions of Druids go way back to around the 4th century BC, with the most detailed descriptions coming from Julius Caesar himself. He wrote about them in his accounts of the Gallic Wars, saying they were one of the most respected groups in society, right alongside the nobles. Druids were so influential that they could even stop battles just by stepping in between two armies. But when the Romans invaded, things changed. The Druids' influence was seen as a threat, and by the 1st century AD, Roman emperors like Tiberius and Claudius cracked down on them. By the 2nd century, the Druids had pretty much disappeared from history. Yet, the word Druid pops up again around 750 AD in a poem where the writer praises Jesus as being wiser than any Druid. And while Druids show up in old Irish myths and later Christian stories, they're often portrayed as sorcerers standing against the spread of Christianity. Fast forward to the 18th and 19th centuries, and suddenly, there's a revival of interest in Druids. This movement, called Neo-Druidism, was all about trying to recapture the magic and mystery of the ancient Druids, even though many of the ideas were based on misconceptions from earlier scholars. Still, the fascination with Druids lives on, and today, Neo-Druidism is a thing. Now, where did the word Druid even come from? Well, it traces back to Latin and Greek, but originally it's from a Celtic word that might mean oak knower or great sage. Druids had a strong connection with nature, especially oak trees, which were considered sacred. So, what did Druids actually do? According to ancient writers, they were involved in pretty much every important aspect of society. They were the ones leading rituals, making sacrifices, and even predicting the future. They were so respected that if they stepped into a battle, the fighting would stop. The training to become a Druid was intense. Caesar mentioned that it could take up to 20 years to learn all the Druidic knowledge, which was passed down entirely by word of mouth. They believed that keeping their teachings secret and relying on memory made their wisdom even more powerful. And now let's dive into some darker territory, their involvement in rituals, especially sacrifices. So according to ancient Greek and Roman writers, Druids were known for practicing human sacrifice. Yep, you heard that right, human sacrifice. Julius Caesar himself wrote that Druids would often sacrifice people who had been found guilty of crimes like theft, considering them the best candidates. But when criminals were in short supply, innocent people might have been chosen instead. One of the most infamous forms of sacrifice was burning victims alive in a giant wooden structure, something we've come to know as the Wicker Man. There's another account from a 10th century text, the Commenta Bernensia, which described different methods of sacrifice for different gods. For example, sacrifices to the gods Teutates, Essis, and Tyrannus were carried out by drowning, hanging, and burning, respectively. This practice was sometimes referred to as the threefold death. It wasn't just about the sacrifice itself. The Druids also played a critical role in the rituals. Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian, mentioned that for a sacrifice to be effective, it had to be conducted in the presence of a Druid. These Druids acted as intermediaries between the people and the gods, interpreting the god's will through rituals like observing how a person's body moved as they died or how the blood flowed from a wound. Now, there is some archaeological evidence to suggest that human sacrifices might have actually taken place, particularly in what are believed to be ritual sites in ancient Gaul. Mass graves found in places like Gournay-sur-Ronde and Ribemont-sur-Ancre have been interpreted by some archaeologists as evidence of these sacrifices, possibly to war gods. But here's the twist. Other experts argue that these graves might not be evidence of sacrifice at all, but rather burial sites for honored warriors. This brings up an important point. How much of what we know about Druidic sacrifices is true, and how much is just Roman or Greek propaganda? Some historians think that the stories of Druids sacrificing humans might have been exaggerated by the Romans to paint the Celts as barbaric, making the Romans seem more civilized by comparison. After all, portraying the Druids as savage could justify the Roman conquests of Celtic lands. In fact, some scholars like Nora Chadwick, who was an expert in Celtic literature, believed that the Druids were more likely philosophers and spiritual leaders rather than the bloodthirsty figures the Romans made them out to be. She even suggested that these stories of human sacrifice could have been Roman fabrications. Speaking of philosophy, the Druids were deeply involved in spiritual and philosophical teachings. Many ancient sources, like Alexander Cornelius Polyhistor, compared Druidic beliefs to those of the Pythagoreans, especially when it came to the concept of the immortality of the soul and reincarnation. They believed that after death, the soul simply moved into a new body, which is a belief that really shaped their whole approach to life and death. Caesar even noted that the Druids emphasized this belief in their teachings because it helped remove the fear of death, which they believed was crucial for developing courage. Besides that, they also taught about the stars, natural philosophy, and the mysteries of religion. And if that wasn't enough, Druids also pop up in mythological stories, especially in Irish folklore. They're often portrayed as powerful seers and advisors to kings, capable of prophecy and other mystical abilities. One famous example is Cothvith, the chief druid in the court of King Concobar mac Nessa of Ulster. He could foresee the future and even predicted the tragic events surrounding Deirdre of the Sorrows, a central figure in the Ulster cycle of Irish mythology. The most legendary druid of all might be Áurinn Glúingel, a bard and judge for the Milesians. According to myth, he used his mystical powers to help his people conquer Ireland, earning the title of Chief Alum of Ireland. And it's not just the men who held power. Irish mythology also features female druids, or bandrew, who played significant roles in both cultural and religious life. Figures like Botmol, Tlachtga, and Barog are all powerful female druids who left their mark on the ancient time. And now let's dive deeper into the sources that shed light on the beliefs and practices of the Druids, especially from the perspectives of Greek and Roman writers. The earliest literary mentions of Druids come from the classical world, primarily Greece and Rome. Archaeologist Stuart Piggott compared the attitudes of these classical authors toward the Druids to the way 15th and 18th century Europeans perceived the societies they encountered in the Americas and South Sea Islands. Both groups of writers viewed these societies through a lens of primitivism, often emphasizing what they considered to be the barbaric qualities of less technologically advanced cultures. Historian Nora Chadwick categorized these classical accounts into two distinct groups, which were later adopted by Piggott. The first group is known as the Posidonian tradition, named after Posidonius, one of its primary proponents. This tradition largely took a critical view of the Iron Age societies of Western Europe, portraying them as barbaric and backward. On the other hand, the Alexandrian group, rooted in the scholastic traditions of Alexandria, Egypt, offered a more sympathetic and idealized view of these foreign cultures. Piggott drew parallels between this categorization and the concepts of hard primitivism and soft primitivism, which were explored by historians of ideas like Lovejoy and Franz Boas. However, not all scholars believe these classical accounts are reliable. Some argue that these depictions of Druids might have been entirely fictional, created by classical writers to reinforce the notion of a barbaric other beyond the civilized Greco-Roman world. This idea would have served to justify the expansion of the Roman Empire into these regions. The earliest known records mentioning Druids come from around 300 BCE in two Greek texts. One was a history of philosophy by Sotion of Alexandria, and the other was a study of magic attributed to Aristotle. Unfortunately, both texts are lost, but they were quoted by Diogenes Laertius in his work Vitae. These texts suggested that the study of philosophy had its origins among barbarians, listing various groups, including the Druids of the Celts and Gauls. Julius Caesar's Commentarii de Bello Gallico, written in the 50s or 40s BCE, provides the earliest detailed description of Druids. Caesar, who was deeply involved in the conquest of Gaul and Britain, described the Druids as integral to Gaulish society, overseeing divine worship, sacrifices, and the interpretation of rituals. He noted that they played a significant role in maintaining order in society, serving as judges, and even mentioned that they believed in the immortality of the soul and the transference of souls after death. According to Caesar, Britain was considered the center of Druidic study, and young men spent many years learning their teachings. However, Caesar's account has been widely criticized by modern historians for its accuracy. Some believe that Caesar may have exaggerated or even manipulated the depiction of Druids to justify his military campaigns in Gaul. For instance, Fustel de Coulanges pointed out that despite describing Druids as powerful figures in Gaulish society, Caesar did not mention them in his accounts of his conquests. Historian Ronald Hutton suggested that Caesar might have portrayed Druids as both civilized and barbaric to support his narrative of the necessity of Roman rule. Despite these criticisms, some historians accept that Caesar's account may hold some truth. Norman DeWitt proposed that Caesar's description might have reflected an idealized version of Druidic society from an earlier time, before the Roman invasions weakened the Gaulish Confederation. Others, like Miranda Aldhouse Green, defended Caesar's accounts, arguing that while he may have embellished certain aspects, it's unlikely he fabricated the existence of such a structured Druidic class. Beyond Caesar, other classical writers also commented on the Druids. Cicero, a contemporary of Caesar, mentioned meeting a Gallic Druid named Diviciacus, who was knowledgeable about nature and practiced divination. Although it's debatable whether Diviciacus was truly a Druid, as Caesar himself did not refer to him as one, Cicero's account adds another layer to our understanding of these enigmatic figures. Diodorus Siculus, writing shortly after Caesar, described Druids as philosophers and theologians, while Strabo, writing a few decades later, identified three types of honored figures in Gaulish society. Bards means poets and singers, Ovates means diviners and natural philosophers, and Druids means moral philosophers. Tacitus, a Roman senator and historian, also mentioned Druids in his account of the Roman invasion of the island of Mona, modern-day Anglesey, where he described them as terrifying figures who invoked curses upon the Roman soldiers. Despite this, Tacitus portrayed them negatively, as ignorant savages. In the Middle Ages, after the Christianization of Ireland and Wales, Druids continued to appear in various sources, mainly in tales and stories. These were often written by Christian monks, who portrayed Druids as sorcerers with supernatural powers, respected for their ability to perform divination and cast spells. However, their role in society diminished with the advent of Christianity, and they were gradually relegated to the status of mere sorcerers in Irish law texts. In Welsh literature, Druids are far less prominent than in Irish sources. The term commonly associated with Druids in Wales, Driel, referred to prophets rather than sorcerers or pagan priests. Some historians, like Ronald Hutton, suggest that the term may have been borrowed from Irish or even English usage, where it referred to magicians and magic. So, as we see, the accounts of Druids from the classical world are a mixed bag, colored by the biases and motivations of those who wrote them. Whether these figures were revered philosophers, feared sorcerers, or simply convenient constructs of a Roman narrative, the truth remains shrouded in the mists of time.